In this issue, we will talk about people who lived on a desert island or an uninhabited part of the land, whose life has been documented. It is very unfair to people who voluntarily or unwittingly find themselves on an uninhabited island, called Robinsons. Indeed, many of them lived long before the famous hero Daniel Defoe, and much longer than his prototype, Alexander Selkirk. We will restore the order of things. Before you are 10 famous, at one time, people living on uninhabited islands, whose incredible stories have been documented. This Portuguese, one of the first documented Robinsons, came to St. Helena in 1513. He was a forced settler, landed on an uninhabited coast for the crimes he committed. Despite the fact that before that he was deprived of his right hand, nose, ears, and fingers on his left hand, he lived on the island for 30 years. Another was the fate of our next hero. He voluntarily left the expedition of Magellan in 1522, when sailors landed on one of the Mariana Islands. They found it only 4 years later, and by that time he had managed to independently explore 13 islands of the archipelago. And it was Gonzalo that became the first official Robinson of the Pacific Ocean. The next character was a real Robinson who survived a shipwreck off the coast of Peru. Pedro suffered terrible trials. The uninhabited island onto which the sea threw him in 1540 did not have a single patch of vegetation. Sea turtle, their eggs served as food for the sailor, and he collected water during the rain in tortoise shells. So he lived for 3 years, until he acquired a neighbor, who was also washed ashore after the crash. In total, the sailor spent 10 years on the island until he was saved by a ship passing by. The 2 sailors, who arrived on the Dutch ship Batavia in 1629, did not even know how much they would have to survive. The ship crashed, many escaped, followed by an uprising and mass killings. The survivors were waiting for no less cruel fate. Most were hanged, and our 2 heroes were landed on the coast of southern Australia. There they remained until their death, having a huge impact on the fate of local tribes. Golden Dragon, a Dutch merchant ship, sank in the early morning of April 28, 1656 off the coast of the same ill-fated Australia. 75 passengers escaped, 7 of whom went on a surviving boat to Jakarta. Arriving there in the summer of 1957, the sailors organized a rescue expedition to the crash site. But by that time only traces of the camp remained from the remaining passengers, and they themselves had left in an unknown direction. Their fate remains unknown to this day. And finally, we got to the most famous Robinson in the world. Alexander Selkirk in this story is not such a harmless and unhappy victim of circumstances. To begin with, the prototype of Robinson Crusoe was a pirate, and was landed on a desert island after a quarrel with the captain in the spring of 1704. Further, everything, more or less, corresponds to history. Alexander built a hut for himself, hunted fish and sea turtles, and also tamed wild goats. But he lived on a desert island for a little over 4 years, and then was saved. Phillip Ashton lived 16 months on Roten Island in the Caribbean. He ended up on the island after being captured by the pirates in 1722 and successfully escaping from them in 1723. After being rescued, the sailor wrote memoirs about his life on a desert island. Ironically, no one believed him, since by this time the famous book of Daniel Defoe had already been printed. Yakov Minkov found himself on uninhabited shores at the behest of the captain of a fishing vessel, who left him on the island of Bering to guard the harvested furs. The captain promised to return for the sailor in 2 months, however, it was a long 7 years before Jacob saw the people again. During his Robinsonade, he sewed clothes from Arctic fox skins, arranged a yurt in which he spent winter frosty evenings. Only in 1812, saved by a passing ship, he returned home. The shipwreck, as a result of which Daniel found himself on the shore of an uninhabited rocky spit, occurred in the southern latitudes of the Pacific Ocean in 1809. The poor man had to eat seal meat and drink rainwater, which accumulated in the recesses of stones. He built a strong house out of stones, and sewed warm clothes from sealskin skins. For 5 long years he lived on the island before he was rescued. Among the famous Robinsons of their time were women. One of them, Juan Maria, forgotten during the operation to rescue the Native American population of the island of San Nicolas, lived on a desert island from 1835 to 1853. Contemporaries who managed to get to know her after salvation describe her as a strong woman who herself ran a household, despite her very venerable age. Unfortunately, after the rescue, Juan Maria died very quickly, like her fellow tribesmen 20 years earlier. This happened because of the diseases that Europeans brought with them to the American continent.